Do you want to sleep? Then listen to me. Turn off the lights, close the windows, now close them and listen to you. Finally, I will make a request to you. Put down your phone and listen to my voice. Listen clearly. I will now tell you a story that will make you sleepy. Close your eyes and listen carefully to my words.
The Boy Without a Crown. Long before the legends of Camelot shimmered like gold in the imagination of storytellers, before Merlin grew into a figure of myth, before Excalibur gleamed in the hands of a king, there was only a boy with no title, no land, no clear place in the world. The Britain he was born into was not the Britain of shining castles or noble quests. It was a land patched together from the ruins of the Roman Empire, a place of mist, scattered tribes, and memories of order fading into chaos. Villages were small, wooden, and frightened. Foreign raiders appeared along the coasts. Local warlords battled for scraps of power, and the old Roman roads, once alive with marching legions, now lay cracked and lonely, swallowed by weeds. Somewhere in this uncertain land, a child was growing up, quietly, humbly, unaware that centuries later the world would speak his name in whispers of wonder. Arthur. Was he the son of a minor war leader, a noble orphan hidden away for protection, or simply a gifted, charismatic youth who rose above the storms of his time? The truth is buried deep beneath layers of legend, poetry, and medieval imagination. But every story, no matter how grand, begins somewhere simple. And Arthur's story begins with a mystery. People spoke of a wise druid or wizard who watched over the boy from a distance. They spoke of prophecies whispered among the elders, of a child who would rise when Britain needed him most. But if you had seen Arthur then, barefoot in the grass, practicing with a wooden stick, helping his family, living a life no different from any other child, you would never guess that he would one day be called the once and future king. Yet even in these early days, something subtle set him apart. A calmness in his gaze, a way he listened, a quiet strength growing like the roots of an ancient oak. And far away, in the deep forests where the old magic still lived, a figure in a gray cloak watched the boy with thoughtful eyes, waiting, preparing, because the world was about to change, and when it did, Arthur would be needed. Long before anyone whispered the name Arthur, Britain was a land of broken kingdoms. Roman rule had vanished like smoke. Saxons pushed across the coasts. Old tribal kings fought over scraps of power. And in the middle of this crumbling world, a single story kept resurfacing. It spoke of a child born in secret. Not a prince raised in golden halls, not a warrior's son taught to fight, but a boy hidden away in a countryside manor, raised quietly, humbly, and without any hint of the destiny waiting for him. Some called him Wart. Others didn't call him anything at all, just another orphan living under the roof of a minor noble family. But history leaves hints. There was a tradition in post-Roman Britain of hiding the heirs of fallen leaders, protecting them from rival warlords. It happened often, too often, and scholars have wondered, was there really a hidden boy who would one day rise to unite them? Whoever he was, he learned more than swordplay. He learned the hard discipline of survival in a fractured land, the manners of the hall and the grit of the field, the weight of leadership long before ever wanting it. And there was always someone older guiding him. Not a wizard in a pointy hat, but perhaps a druid, a priest, or simply a wise elder who understood that Britain needed more than warlords. It needed a symbol. Later storytellers would turn that mentor into the legendary Merlin. But in the beginning, he was simply a guardian preparing a child for a future he could not yet imagine. Because somewhere in the hills of Britain, kings were falling, kingdoms were dying, and a storm was coming. A storm that this boy, this unknown, unremarkable child, would one day be expected to stand against, and whether he liked it or not, Britain would soon need him.
For generations, the people of post-Roman Britain whispered stories of a prophecy, a promise that someday, when the land was fractured and weary, a true king would rise, not by birthright, but by worthiness. And so the tale begins on a misty winter morning in a quiet clearing near Londinium, where a strange stone suddenly appeared overnight. Not a simple boulder, but a block of pale granite, streaked silver, as if carved by frost itself. Embedded in its center was a sword. Its hilt glimmered like fresh snow under moonlight. Its blade seemed untouched by rust or time. And just beneath it, a message no one could ignore. Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is rightwise king of all Britain. People gasped. Priests murmured prayers. Warriors tested their strength. And word spread like wildfire. Chieftains came first, armored and proud. Each wrapped their hands around the sword, muscles straining, faces reddening, yet the weapon never moved an inch. Then came ambitious warlords, men who dreamed of crowns. They pulled until their palms bled. Nothing. Even seasoned knights tried, their reputations heavy on their shoulders. They tugged, cursed, and even prayed, as though the Hemans themselves might loosen the steel. Still nothing. But then, quietly, almost unnoticed, arrived a young boy named Arthur, not yet a legend, just a foster child helping his older brother Kay. While the nobles fought for their chance to grasp the sword, Arthur simply tried to retrieve Kay's lost weapon. He approached the stone unaware of destiny watching him. The clearing hushed. The air thickened. Arthur touched the sword, and in a moment gentle as rising dawn, it slid free as if the stone were made of water. Gasps broke through the silence. Some bowed, some stared in disbelief, some angrily refused to accept what their own eyes had seen. But the truth could not be undone. A boy, humble, quiet, unprepared, had done what none of the greatest warriors of Britain could do. The legend of King Arthur was born. Yet behind the wonder, one question lingered like a shadow. Was this magic, or a carefully crafted moment of politics and symbolism? For every storyteller who swears the sword was divine, a historian wonders whether the event masked a deeper truth about alliances, power, and the shaping of a king. And so the mystery deepens. The sword that should not exist. The fire in the old historian's study burns low, casting sleepy gold across the shelves of scrolls and dust-covered books. You lean closer as he continues the tale, his voice soft and steady, like pages turning themselves. Every legend, he says, has a moment where the ordinary world breaks and something impossible steps through. For Arthur, that moment was was the sword. But not the magical sword you're thinking of. Not yet. Long before Excalibur shone beneath the waves, there was another blade, quiet, unremarkable, and somehow far more mysterious. Archaeologists found it in a peat bog in Wales, a child's sword, no longer than a forearm, its bronze hilt twisted by time. But the odd part wasn't the sword itself. It was the inscription, a line of markings carved by someone who lived more than 1,000 years before the medieval Arthur tales were written. The symbols were faint, fragile, and unmistakably Celtic. When translated, they read, "For the protector of the tribe, for the one who stands alone." You close your eyes as the historian speaks. The rain outside taps softly against the windows. A gentle rumble of thunder rolls far away. Most people don't know this, but the earliest Arthur stories didn't begin with kings or castles or round tables. They began with a single warrior who guarded his people during a time when Britain was fracturing, piece by piece, tribe by tribe. No shining armor, no royal court, just a leader carrying an old tradition on his shoulders. And suddenly, Arthur feels less like a legend and more like the echo of a real person. Someone who might have walked across those wind-swept hills, sword in hand, hearing the distant drums of invading armies. The historian sighs, leaning back in his chair. He whispers, "The sword in the stone. That came much later, a story layered over an older truth, a truth already fading like smoke." You picture a lonely warrior standing on a cliff edge, the sea roaring below. No magic, no miracles, just courage. And in the quiet of the historian's study, it becomes clear. If there was a real Arthur, he wouldn't have needed magic to be extraordinary.
The Sword in the Stone. History or myth? The legend says a young boy named Arthur pulled a sword from a stone, proving he was the rightful king of Britain. But to understand where this strange story came from, we must look back, far before Merlin, far before Camelot, into the shifting, war-torn landscape of early medieval Britain. Because the truth may be less magical, yet even more fascinating. A land without a king. In the centuries after the Romans abandoned Britain, everything fractured. Local warlords fought for land. Foreign tribes, Saxons, Angles, Jutes, pushed inward. Kings appeared and vanished in the space of a single winter. No one truly controlled the island, so storytellers crafted a symbol, a king chosen not by blood, but by destiny. A sword locked inside a stone, something impossible for ordinary men, suggested a leader touched by the divine, someone who could unite the broken land. But was there a real event behind the myth? A possible historical root. Historians point to a real tradition among Celtic tribes, ritual swords embedded into a stone or anvil-like structures as symbols of kingship. Some chiefs were chosen by tests of strength or ceremonial trials. A contender might have been required to lift a heavy stone, draw a weapon fitted tightly into a rock, or perform a feat that symbolized authority. Over time, a simple tribal ritual could become a glowing legend. And the Romans had their own influence too. In their myths, only the chosen hero could wield the sacred sword of destiny. The idea may have blended with native British stories. Could the sword in the stone be real after all? Surprisingly, archaeologists have found something intriguing. At the ancient church of San Galgano in Italy lies a real medieval sword driven into solid stone, still visible today. It was placed there by a 12th century knight. This shows one important thing. The concept was physically possible. People really did thrust swords into stone for symbolic reasons. So while Arthur's miracle moment likely didn't happen exactly as told, it may reflect real customs, real rituals, real struggles for power. And one more detail keeps the legend alive. Once Arthur pulled the sword free, the story says he didn't just gain a weapon, he gained a destiny. That destiny is what we explore in the next chapter, as Arthur takes his first steps toward becoming Britain's greatest legendary king. The sword that wasn't in the stone. For centuries, storytellers have spoken of a young Arthur pulling a sword from a stone, a miracle, a sign of divine kingship, proof that he was chosen by fate itself. But when historians begin to examine the legend more closely, something surprising appears. There is no early record of Arthur drawing any sword from any stone. The earliest Welsh sources, the poems, the chronicles, the heroic tales, never mention it. So where did such an iconic moment come from? To understand this, we must travel back to a Europe where kings ruled through ritual, blades were symbols of sacred power, and the act of drawing a sword was often political, not magical. In fact, archaeologists have discovered something fascinating. In the early Middle Ages, real swords were sometimes embedded into stones as ceremonial markers, not to test strength, but to symbolize that a warrior clan had claimed a sacred site. So the story may have grown from a real practice, even if Arthur himself never performed it. There is also another thread. In the 12th century, a writer named Robert de Boron introduced the idea that the sword came from the hand of God, shaping Arthur into a divinely appointed king. Stories at the time were shifting. Arthur was no longer a war leader. He was becoming a miracle-born monarch. This shift says more about medieval Europe than it does about Roman-era Britain. Back then, rulers needed a sign of heavenly approval, a miracle, a moment where destiny could be seen by all. And a sword appearing in a stone, waiting only for the purest, bravest, and most rightful king, was exactly the kind of myth people loved. But behind this legend hides a deeper truth. There was likely a young leader, an Arthur-like figure, who rose from obscurity to unify warriors and tribes. He may not have drawn a sword from a stone, but he did something far rarer. He earned the loyalty of clans who often trusted no one. So the legend of the sword, though not historical, reflects something real about leadership. Kings are not born in miracles. They are forged in loyalty, courage, and the belief of the people around them. And for Arthur, that belief, real or imagined, was powerful enough to echo for 1,500 years. Avalon, mythical island or real lost world? As evening settles over Britain, a soft mist rolls in across the landscape, the kind of silver haze that makes ancient legends feel strangely possible. Scholars call Avalon mythical. Poets call it eternal. But to the people of the early Middle Ages, Avalon was something far more powerful. A promise. A promise that heroes did not truly die. A promise that wounds could be healed. A promise that somewhere, beyond the world we can touch, there existed a place where the greatest king in Britain waited to return. And so we enter the mystery. A wounded king. In almost every version of the Arthur legend, the final battle at Camlan ends the same way. Arthur, gravely wounded by Mordred, is carried away from the battlefield, but not to a normal healer or a monastery or a royal tomb. Instead, his allies bring him to a boat. The river is silent, the sky low and gray, and waiting aboard are women in hooded robes, often called the Nine Sisters, or more famously, Morgan Le Fay. No one speaks as they take Arthur by the arms and lift him onto the vessel. The boat glides into the mist, and the wounded king disappears into a world we cannot see, toward a place where mortals do not normally go. Avalon. What is Avalon? Descriptions of Avalon shift from century to century. A mystical island where magic still breathes. A paradise of apple orchards and eternal spring. A druidic sanctuary filled with ancient knowledge. A healing isle where time moves differently. A gateway between the mortal world and the other world. Its name may come from the Welsh word aval, meaning apple, a fruit long associated with immortality and otherworldly realms. But was it real? The historian's hypothesis. Some historians believe Avalon may have been a real island. Glastonbury, England, is often suggested. It once was an island, surrounded by marshland, and in medieval times, monks claim to have found the graves of Arthur and Guinevere there. Others think Avalon was a memory of older Celtic beliefs, a realm like the Irish Tir na Nog, the land of youth, or the Welsh Annwn, an otherworld ruled by powerful spirits. To early Britons, the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual one was thin. Avalon could easily be both, a real place and a doorway into myth. A king who waits. The most mysterious part of the legend is not where Arthur was taken, but why. Many medieval texts say, Arthur did not die. He sleeps. He waits. He heals, and he will return when Britain needs him most. This idea transformed Arthur from a historical war leader into something more powerful, a symbol, a nation's dream, a beacon in dark times. Kings fall, but legends return. And so Avalon endures. Today, scholars debate. Tourists climb Glastonbury Tor. Poets still write of silver boats slipping through the mist. No matter what the historians conclude, Avalon remains one thing: the heart of the Arthurian legend. A place where history ends and hope begins. Avalon, mythical island, or real lost world. As evening settles over Britain, a soft mist rolls in across the landscape, the kind of silver haze that makes ancient legends feel strangely possible. Scholars call Avalon mythical. Poets call it eternal. But to the people of the early Middle Ages, Avalon was something far more powerful. A promise. A promise that heroes did not truly die. A promise that wounds could be healed. A promise that somewhere, beyond the world we can touch, there existed a place where the greatest king in Britain waited to return. And so we enter the mystery. A wounded king. In almost every version of the Arthur legend, the final battle at Camlan ends the same way. Arthur, gravely wounded by Mordred, is carried away from the battlefield, but not to a normal healer, or a monastery, or a royal tomb. Instead, his allies bring him to a boat. The river is silent, the sky low and gray, and waiting aboard are women in hooded robes, often called the Nine Sisters, or more famously, Morgan Le Fay. No one speaks as they take Arthur by the arms and lift him onto the vessel. The boat glides into the mist, and the wounded king disappears into a world we cannot see, toward a place where mortals do not normally go. Avalon. What is Avalon? Descriptions of Avalon shift from century to century. A mystical island where magic still breathes. A paradise of apple orchards and eternal spring. A druidic sanctuary filled with ancient knowledge. A healing isle where time moves differently. A gateway between the mortal world and the other world. Its name may come from the Welsh word aval, meaning apple, a fruit long associated with immortality and otherworldly realms. But was it real? The historian's hypothesis. Some historians believe Avalon may have been a real island. Glastonbury, England, is often suggested. It once was an island, surrounded by marshland, and in medieval times, monks claim to have found the graves of Arthur and Guinevere there. Others think Avalon was a memory of older Celtic beliefs, a realm like the Irish Tir na Nog, the land of youth, or the Welsh Annwn, an otherworld ruled by powerful spirits. To early Britons, the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual one was thin. Avalon could easily be both, a real place and a doorway into myth. A king who waits. The most mysterious part of the legend is not where Arthur was taken, but why. Many medieval texts say, Arthur did not die, he sleeps, he waits, he heals, and he will return when Britain needs him most. This idea transformed Arthur from a historical war leader into something more powerful, a symbol, a nation's dream, a beacon in dark times. Kings fall, but legends return. And so Avalon endures. Today, scholars debate. Tourists climb Glastonbury Tor. Poets still write of silver boats slipping through the mist. No matter what the historians conclude, Avalon remains one thing: the heart of the Arthurian legend. A place where history ends and hope begins.
The last embers of Camelot. Even the greatest legends fade, and by the time Arthur entered the final chapter of his life, The golden glow of Camelot had begun to flicker like a dying candle. Whispers moved across the kingdom. The round table was breaking. Knights who once rode side by side now quarreled over honor, over pride, over wounds too deep for any healer's salve. But truth and myth mingle most strongly here, in Arthur's last days, where history becomes mist. Was there really a fall of Camelot? What we call Camelot's collapse might reflect the slow unraveling of real Romano-British defenses. Archaeology shows that Roman fortresses, once manned by disciplined soldiers, were being abandoned. Walls that should have stood firm were crumbling. Tribes that once cooperated began turning on one another. If Arthur was a real war leader, he may have watched, helplessly, as alliances he built through force and charisma began to slip out of his grasp. The betrayal that echoes through time. No story in Arthurian lore is more famous or more painful than the betrayal by Lancelot and Guinevere. But historians debate whether it ever happened at all. Instead, this legendary affair may simply symbolize a deeper truth, that even the strongest kingdoms fall not from an outside enemy, but from tension within. To storytellers, their love was the spark. To historians, it was likely a metaphor, an illustration of political fracture. Either way, Camelot began to dim. The shadow of Mordred. Then came Mordred, Arthur's greatest enemy and perhaps his own blood. In medieval stories, Mordred is treachery incarnate, born either of sin or prophecy. But in early Welsh texts, he is more complicated, a rival leader, possibly even a legitimate claimant to power. Some historians believe he represents a real challenger, someone who clashed with Arthur's alliance, accelerating its collapse. Whatever his true origins, Mordred stepped into the story at the exact moment everything was falling apart. A kingdom at a crossroads. As Saxon pressure increased, the inner fractures of Arthur's realm widened. Camelot's unity, once its greatest strength, had become fragile. The stage was set for the battle that would end it all. The legend describes a sky heavy with storm clouds, knights gripping spears slicked with dew, and Arthur knowing deep within himself that this was the last dawn he would ever ride into. A real historical leader may have faced a similar final stand, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, watching the borders he fought to protect slip away. And whether he was a mythic king or a forgotten general, his story was about to reach its tragic end. For every legend has a moment where its flame begins to fade, and this was Camelot's.
The sword beneath the lake. Night has settled over ancient Britain as if the sky has pulled a velvet curtain across the world. The forests darken, the rivers turn to smooth ribbons of silver, and in this quiet, shadowed land, another layer of Arthur's legend begins to glow. Because while Arthur's sword in the stone is famous, there is another sword, deeper, older, and far more mysterious. Excalibur. Not the one he pulled from the stone, not the one that proved his right to rule. This Excalibur is different, a weapon said to have come from the Lady of the Lake, a being who stands half in legend, half in something older than legend, perhaps older even than the Celtic gods themselves. But to understand Excalibur, we step back, not into myth, but into history. Across Iron Age Britain, Lakes and rivers were believed to be gateways. People left offerings there: spears, shields, swords, even entire chariots. Metal had power, water had mystery. To give a weapon to the water was to give it to the gods. Archaeologists have found hundreds of real ancient swords placed deliberately in lakes, bent, broken, or left to sink. These weren't accidents, they were rituals. So when medieval storytellers described Arthur receiving his sword from a mystical woman rising from a lake, they weren't inventing something new. They were echoing something much older. A cultural memory, a ritual thousands of years deep. And that is where Excalibur becomes more than a magical weapon. It becomes a symbol, not of war, but of legitimacy, of kingly authority, granted not by birth, not by conquest, but by something sacred and ancient. Whether Arthur was real or not, the idea behind Excalibur was real to the people who first heard the stories. It meant that a true king was chosen by forces beyond human ambition, chosen by the land itself. The stories say the sword shone like star metal, that its scabbard could prevent blood loss, that it was unbreakable. But to the people who lived in post-Roman Britain, a fractured land desperate for unity, Excalibur was not just a weapon, it was hope. A promise that somewhere, somehow, a rightful leader could rise again. And so, as mist curls over quiet waters, as reeds whisper in the dark, the legend of Excalibur waits, half submerged, half remembered, ready for the moment Arthur needs it most. In the next chapter, we follow the trail of another powerful symbol, one that shaped Arthur's court, his reign, and the entire mythic world around him: the Knights of the Round Table.
The sword that would not sleep. Night falls gently over the hills of early medieval Britain. Mist slides across the grass like drifting silver, and somewhere in the quiet dark, a blackbird gives a sleepy chirp. It is the kind of night when the world seems to pause, as if listening. And at the center of this stillness lies a question scholars have chased for centuries. Was Excalibur real? Not the glowing, enchanted sword of later legends, but a weapon that meant something, that carried weight beyond metal. Archaeologists have long known that early warriors often treated swords as sacred objects. They were bent, buried, or offered to lakes and rivers during ceremonies. To the people of the time, a blade was not simply a tool. It was identity, status, a soul forged in iron. So when medieval writers described Arthur receiving a sword from a lake, modern historians pause, because that image wasn't invented out of nowhere. It echoed an older, much deeper ritual in Celtic culture. Imagine it. A chieftain stands at the water's edge. The sky is pale before dawn. The lake is perfectly still, holding the reflection of the world like a dream. Priests chant. A new leader steps forward, and from the dark, silent water, a sacred blade is raised, as if the spirit of the land itself has chosen him. Poetic? Yes. Impossible? No. And so the legend of Excalibur may not be a fantasy after all, but a memory preserved in story of a real ceremony practiced by real people. As centuries passed, the story changed. grew brighter, more magical, until the lake became a lady. The sword became unbreakable, and the ritual became destiny. But at its heart, there may have once been a real sword that marked a real leader. Not a king of glittering castles, but a war chief standing on the shore of a misty British lake, chosen by the rituals of his people. A sword that gleamed at sunrise. A sword that never slept. A sword that, in one form or another, still survives in legend.
The sword beneath the waves. Night settles over Britain like a velvet cloak, and the scholars gathered in the old library fall silent. Candles crackle, dust hangs in the light, and once again the question rises: if Arthur was real, what became of him? Some say he died on the battlefield. Some say he was carried to Avalon. But others, those who whisper, not speak, point to a different clue: the sword beneath the waves. For centuries, coastal villages told a quiet story, not a grand epic, not a polished myth, a memory. Fishermen spoke of a glimmer in the water on still nights, a pale light as if moonbeams were trapped beneath the sea. Travelers claimed that in the silence before dawn, when the tide held its breath, they saw the silhouette of a woman rising from the water's skin, her arm pale as marble, her fingers tracing circles on the surface. The Lady of the Lake. Was she a goddess, a guardian spirit, or simply a metaphor for something forgotten and misunderstood? Historians propose another theory, that the lady was a priestess of an ancient water cult, a remnant of Celtic tradition sworn to guard sacred relics. If so, she may have kept a real sword, a chieftain's heirloom, reforged and polished until it gleamed like a shard of the sun, a sword worthy of a leader like Arthur. And if a priestess held such a relic, then the tale of returning the blade to the waters might echo a very real burial ritual. Across the ancient world, from Britain to Scandinavia to the Rhine, warriors laid their weapons to rest in rivers and lakes, to give them back, to let them sleep. And so, perhaps, when Arthur fell, his companions performed the same rite. They didn't hand a magic sword to a water spirit. They returned their king's blade to the place where sacred things were kept safe. Over time, memory became legend. Legend became myth, and myth grew into the shimmering story we know today. But the scholars in the library know something else, something rarely spoken. Along certain quiet locks in Wales, metal detectors have hummed, divers have descended, and deep beneath silt and stone, they've uncovered blades, ancient, ceremonial, impossibly preserved. None have been proven to be Excalibur, but each discovery whispers the same thought. The truth may not be magic, but it is no less extraordinary. The candles burn low. Another chapter closes,
But King Arthur, real or legend, continues to ride through the mists of history. And somewhere, beneath waters older than memory, a sword sleeps still.